The name Chesapeake means Great Shellfish Bay, so it is no surprise that oysters have played a role in the local economy for as long as there have been people in the area. Native Americans seasonally occupied oyster harvesting camps on the shore, and European settlers had established their own harvesting practices by the 1680s. At first, oysters were harvested using boats, rakes, and by wading into shallow water to simply gather them, though by the 1700s, tongs were more commonly used. However, serious environmental degradation and overexploitation started to show up when oystermen started to use dredging equipment in the early 1800s, though this technique was later banned to protect the oysters. The oyster industry brought lots of jobs to the region, such as those at the oyster canneries which first opened in Baltimore in the 1820s. Legislation in Maryland allowing residents to harvest in the local waters of the public fishery and relegalizing dredging led to a boom in the industry in the late 1800s. The number of bushels harvested per year jumped from 700,000 in Maryland in 1839 to 14 to 20 million in the 1880s. The industry was so lucrative that a series of oyster wars took place, where oyster pirates and legal watermen in Maryland and Virginia fought over harvesting rights in the Chesapeake Bay. These disputes did not end until the mid-20th century. Oyster populations were rapidly declining, though, which Virginia tried to combat by creating a shell planting and oyster seed moving repletion program in the 1920s called the Young of the Year. Unfortunately, these efforts were not enough to prevent the collapse of the public fishery in the 1960s due to a combination of overexploitation and an epidemic of the oyster disease called MSX. Virginia's private leasehold fishery, in which individuals rent areas outside the public grounds to plant shells and oysters for their own private use, stayed afloat for a little longer, but by the 1980s it too had collapsed. This collapse was caused in part by a different oyster disease known as dermo, though harvests had already fallen over 50% in 4 years by the time of this epidemic. Until the 80s, oysters had supported the most valuable fishery in the bay, but no longer. Nowadays, reefs only cover about 1% of the historic oyster bottom. To combat the degradation, Maryland protects 24% of its oyster bottom in sanctuaries, where harvesting is prohibited, but areas outside the mapped historic oyster bars and in the water column are available for aquaculture lease. 27 of the 36,000 acres of viable Maryland oyster habitat are still available, though, and from 2009 to 2015, oyster harvests have quadrupled. But there is still work to be done. The supply of oysters in the region's market, which was once dominated by local Chesapeake oysters, is now made up of only 3% local supply. The Chesapeake economy is missing out on a great opportunity by allowing the supply to be outsourced. Healthy reefs will also help restore the populations of other local shellfish and fish species, which will provide a boost to their industries as well. Their benefits extend into recreation as well, since the water will be clearer of pollutants and reefs are known to be great locations for recreational fishing.